Tourist confronts royal guard at Buckingham Palace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand forecourt of Buckingham Palace as crowds of tourists gathered behind the ornate iron gates. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old software engineer from Chicago, clutching his camera with trembling hands. This was his first trip to London, a dream vacation he had saved 3 years to afford. Marcus had arrived at the palace at 7 a.m., hoping to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. He positioned himself strategically near the front of the crowd, his excitement barely contained. The red-coated guards stood motionless at their posts, their tall black bearskin hats creating an imposing silhouette against the palace's cream-colored facade. As the morning progressed, Marcus became increasingly fascinated by the stoic demeanor of the guards. He watched them intently, marveling at their ability to remain perfectly still despite the growing crowd of onlookers. Tourists from around the world pressed against the railings, snapping photos and whispering in various languages. The guard, closest to Marcus, appeared to be in his early 20s, with a stern expression barely visible beneath the shadow of his ceremonial hat. His red tunic was immaculate, brass buttons gleaming in the sunlight. The young soldier held his rifle with practiced precision, his white gloves gripping the weapon as if it were an extension of his own body. Marcus noticed something that others seemed to miss. Every few minutes, the guard's left eye would twitch, slightly, a barely perceptible movement that suggested he might be struggling with something. Perhaps it was fatigue, or maybe an insect was bothering him. The American tourist felt a wave of sympathy for the young man who couldn't even swat away a fly without breaking protocol. The crowd around Marcus grew larger and more boisterous as tour groups arrived. Children pressed their faces against the railings while their parents struggled to control their excitement. Street vendors weaved through the masses, selling postcards and miniature guards as souvenirs. The atmosphere was festive, but Marcus found himself increasingly concerned about the guard's condition. At precisely 10:30 a.m., something changed in the guard's demeanor. His breathing became slightly more labored, and the eye twitching increased in frequency. Marcus, who had been watching intently through his camera lens, noticed beads of sweat forming on the guard's forehead, despite the cool October morning. A tour guide with a thick Scottish accent began explaining the history and traditions of the Queen's Guard to a group of elderly visitors. She spoke about the rigorous training, the honor of the position, and the unwavering dedication required to serve in such a role. Marcus listened while keeping his eyes fixed on the increasingly distressed guard. The young soldier's face had begun to pale, contrasting sharply with his bright red uniform. His jaw was clenched tightly, and Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders despite the formal military posture. Other tourists continued taking selfies and chatting excitedly, oblivious to what Marcus was observing. As minutes passed, Marcus felt a growing sense of urgency. The guard was clearly in distress, yet protocol demanded he remain at his post regardless of personal discomfort. The rigid military tradition that made these ceremonies so impressive was now becoming a potential danger to a young man's well-being. Marcus looked around for any sign of superior officers or other guards who might notice their colleagues' condition, but everyone seemed focused on their own duties or the spectacle of the ceremony. The crowd continued to grow, creating a wall of bodies between Marcus and any potential help. The American tourist faced a dilemma that would change both his vacation and his perspective on duty, tradition, and human compassion. Should he respect the centuries-old protocol and remain silent, or should he act on his instinct to help a fellow human being in need? The decision he was about to make would create ripples far beyond the palace gates, challenging traditions and sparking conversations about the balance between ceremony and humanity. As the guard's condition appeared to worsen, Marcus made a choice that would transform an ordinary tourist experience into an extraordinary story of human connection across cultural boundaries. Tourist confronts royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Continued, Marcus took a deep breath and made his decision. He pushed through the crowd of tourists, ignoring their annoyed protests as he squeezed past families with strollers and elderly visitors with walking sticks. His heart pounded as he approached the iron railings that separated the public from the guards. "Excuse me," Marcus called out in a clear voice, addressing the visibly struggling guard. "Are you all right? You look like you might need some help." The crowd around him fell silent, shocked by this breach of tourist etiquette. Everyone knew you weren't supposed to speak to the guards, let alone express concern for their well-being. Cameras turned toward Marcus instead of the palace, capturing this unexpected moment. The guards' eyes flickered toward Marcus for just a fraction of a second before returning to their fixed forward gaze. But in that brief moment, Marcus saw something that confirmed his suspicions. The young man was indeed in serious distress. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, and a thin line of perspiration was visible along his hairline. "I'm a tourist from America," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet forecourt. "I don't know all your rules, but I can see you're not feeling well. Is there someone I can call for you?" An elderly British woman behind Marcus whispered sharply, "You can't talk to them. They're not allowed to respond." Her companion nodded vigorously, clearly embarrassed by the American's behavior, but Marcus wasn't deterred. He had noticed something else. The guard's left hand was beginning to tremble slightly, despite his rigid military posture. Years of watching his diabetic sister manage her condition had taught Marcus to recognize the signs of a medical emergency. Police officers stationed nearby began walking toward the commotion, his expression stern. The crowd anticipated that Marcus would be removed or reprimanded for his inappropriate behavior. Tour guides started redirecting their groups away from the scene, treating it as an unfortunate disruption to the ceremony. "Please," Marcus said, his voice now urgent. "I think you might be having a medical issue. Your hands are shaking and you're sweating. I've seen this before with my sister. Are you diabetic?" The guard's composure finally cracked for just a moment. His eyes widened slightly and he swayed almost imperceptibly on his feet. It was clear that Marcus had correctly identified the problem, but the young soldier was trapped by duty and protocol. The approaching police officer reached Marcus just as a woman in the crowd gasped. She had been watching through her husband's telephoto camera lens and had seen what Marcus saw. The guard was in genuine medical distress. "Sir, you need to step back from the barriers," the officer said firmly but politely. "The guards cannot interact with the public during their duties." "Officer, please listen," Marcus replied respectfully but urgently. "I believe this guard is having a diabetic episode. He needs medical attention now, not after his duty shift ends." The police officer paused, looking more carefully at the guard in question. He was trained to handle various situations at the palace, but this was unusual. The guard was indeed showing signs of distress, though he was maintaining his position admirably. Meanwhile, other tourists began to take notice. A woman from Germany who worked as a nurse pushed forward, having overheard Marcus's concerns. I'm a medical professional," she said in accented English. "The American man is correct. This soldier needs help immediately." A small crowd of concerned visitors began to gather, creating an unusual scene at the normally orderly palace gates. Some tourists continued taking photos, treating the incident as entertainment, while others showed genuine concern for the guards' well-being. The young soldier's condition was deteriorating. His face had gone pale, and the trembling in his hands was becoming more noticeable despite his attempts to maintain military bearing. The conflict between duty and health was playing out in real time before hundreds of witnesses. Marcus realized that his simple vacation photo opportunity had evolved into something much more significant. He had unwittingly challenged a system, steeped in tradition and protocol by prioritizing human welfare over ceremonial formality. The question now was whether the system would adapt to help one of its own, or whether rigid adherence to tradition would prevail even at the cost of a young man's health. The police officer spoke quietly into his radio, clearly requesting guidance from his superiors on how to handle this unprecedented situation. Tourist confronts royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Continued within minutes, a sergeant appeared from behind the palace gates, his expression serious but controlled. He walked briskly toward the guard in question, his experienced eye immediately assessing the situation. The crowd watched in fascination as military protocol began to unfold in response to Marcus's intervention. The sergeant positioned himself discreetly beside the struggling guard and spoke in a low, authoritative voice. that only the soldier could hear. "Thompson, report your status immediately." "Sergeant, I think my blood sugar is dropping," the guard whispered through clenched teeth, never breaking his forward gaze. "Started feeling dizzy about 20 minutes ago. Can you maintain position?" "For 2 more minutes while relief arrives?" the sergeant asked quietly. "Yes, Sergeant," came the reply, though both men knew it was becoming increasingly difficult. Marcus watched this exchange with relief and admiration. The military system was responding appropriately, but he realized his actions had been necessary to initiate that response. Without his intervention, the young guard might have collapsed at his post. The German nurse remained at the barrier, her professional instincts engaged. "The trembling is getting worse," she called out to anyone in authority who might listen. "This young man needs glucose immediately." A palace guard approached the sergeant and whispered something urgent. Within seconds, a medical officer appeared carrying a small bag. The efficiency of the response impressed even Marcus, who had expected more bureaucratic delay. The crowd had grown significantly, with tourists from various nationalities gathering to witness this unusual scene. A Japanese tour group stood quietly, their guide explaining in hushed tones what was happening. Children pressed against their parents, sensing that something important was occurring. "Ladies and gentlemen," the police officer announced to the crowd, "please maintain a respectful distance while medical personnel assist the guardsman." But Marcus noticed something troubling. Despite the medical officer's presence, the guard was still maintaining his ceremonial position. The conflict between duty and health was reaching a critical point. "Why isn't he being relieved?" Marcus asked the police officer. "He's clearly having a medical emergency." "The changing of the guard ceremony is in 15 minutes, the officer explained. "They're trying to coordinate a replacement without disrupting the schedule." This response frustrated Marcus. In his American mindset, health always trumped ceremony. 15 minutes could be too long, he said firmly. "What if he collapses?" The German nurse nodded in agreement. "In Germany, we would remove him from duty immediately. This is not safe." A British tourist standing nearby defended the system. "You foreigners don't understand. This is tradition. These guards are trained for this. He'll manage." But as if to contradict this confidence, the guard swayed slightly, barely catching himself. The movement was small but noticeable to those watching closely. The medical officer stepped closer, clearly concerned. Marcus made another decision that would further challenge protocol. He pulled out his phone and began recording the scene. "If something happens to this young man because tradition was more important than his health, people need to see it," he said loudly enough for officials to hear. The sergeant turned to look at Marcus, his expression unreadable. Here was a foreign tourist who had identified a problem, forced appropriate response, and was now creating public accountability. It was unprecedented and somewhat admirable, even if it complicated matters. "Sir," the sergeant called to Marcus, "thank you for your concern. We have the situation in hand." "I hope so," Marcus replied, still recording. "Because that young man has been standing there in distress for 30 minutes while everyone worried about ceremony instead of his safety." The crowd murmured their agreement, and Marcus realized he had inadvertently become a spokesperson for prioritizing human welfare over rigid tradition. Tourists from various countries began voicing their own concerns and support for the guards. Immediate relief. The pressure was mounting on the officials to act decisively. The ceremonial changing of the guard was important for tourism and tradition, but the welfare of the guardsmen was ultimately more important. The question was whether the system could adapt quickly enough to prevent a potential medical emergency in front of hundreds of international visitors. Tourist confronts royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Continued. The tension reached its peak when the guard's knees buckled slightly. It was barely noticeable, but the medical officer saw it immediately. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on the young soldier's elbow. "That's it," the medical officer said firmly to the sergeant. "He needs to be relieved now. This cannot wait for the ceremony schedule." The sergeant nodded and spoke into his radio. Within 30 seconds, a replacement guard appeared, marching with precise military steps toward his distressed colleague. The crowd watched in respectful silence as the formal relief procedure began. Marcus felt a surge of relief and pride. His intervention had worked. The system had ultimately prioritized human welfare over ceremonial timing, even if it took public pressure to achieve that outcome. "Guardsman Thompson," the sergeant said quietly, "you are relieved. Report to the medical station immediately." For the first time in over an hour, the young guard broke his rigid posture. He handed his rifle to his replacement and took a shaky step backward. The crowd spontaneously began to applaud, appreciating both his dedication and the system's appropriate response. The German nurse called out encouragingly, "You did very well, young man. Take care of yourself." As the guards completed their formal exchange, Marcus lowered his phone and approached the police officer. "Thank you for handling that properly," he said. "I was worried it might take longer." "You did the right thing, sir," the officer replied, somewhat to Marcus's surprise. Sometimes, it takes an outside perspective to see what those inside the system might miss. The medical officer was now walking alongside Guardsman Thompson as they headed toward the palace medical facility. The young soldier looked pale but relieved to finally receive help. He glanced back briefly at the crowd and seemed to nod slightly in Marcus's direction. An older British gentleman approached Marcus with an extended hand. "I owe you an apology, young man," he said in a refined accent. "I initially thought you were being disrespectful, but you may have prevented a serious incident." Word of the event began spreading through the crowd. Tour guides were updating their groups and tourists were sharing the story with newcomers. The incident had transformed from a potential embarrassment into an example of international cooperation and human compassion. A reporter from a local London newspaper who had been covering routine palace activities found herself with an unexpected story. She approached Marcus for a brief interview. "What made you decide to speak up?" she asked. "My sister is diabetic," Marcus explained. "I've learned to recognize the signs. When you see someone in trouble, you help them, regardless of where you are or what the rules might be." The reporter then spoke with the German nurse who provided professional context for the intervention. "This American gentleman potentially prevented a medical emergency," she stated. "The guard was showing classic signs of hypoglycemia." As the replacement guard settled into position, the atmosphere around the palace gates began to normalize. However, the story was far from over. Social media posts about the incident were beginning to circulate, with tourists sharing videos and photos of the unusual confrontation. A palace spokesperson appeared and addressed the gathered crowd. "We want to thank the concerned visitors who brought our guardsman's condition to our attention," she said diplomatically. "The welfare of our personnel is our top priority, and we appreciate the public's concern." Marcus realized that what had started as a simple tourist concern had evolved into something much larger. He had challenged a centuries-old system and found that, when human welfare was at stake, the system could indeed adapt and respond appropriately. The young guard would recover fully, but the impact of Marcus's actions would continue to ripple outward, raising questions about the balance between tradition, duty, and human compassion in one of the world's most formal and protocol-driven institutions. Tourist confronts royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Continued later that afternoon, Marcus was surprised to receive a message at his hotel. A palace official had requested a brief meeting with him in the hotel lobby. Curious and slightly nervous, he agreed to the encounter. The official, a well-dressed woman in her 50s, introduced herself as Margaret Whitfield from the Palace Communications Office. She thanked Marcus for his intervention and explained that Guardsman Thompson was doing well after receiving proper medical treatment. "We wanted to personally thank you," she said over tea. "Our initial review suggests that Private Thompson had forgotten to eat breakfast due to an early morning family emergency. Your observation and persistence likely prevented him from collapsing at his post." Marcus felt validated but also thoughtful. "I was just doing what anyone should do," he replied, "but I was surprised by how long it took for help to arrive." "Ms. Whitfield nodded thoughtfully. "You've raised some important points about our protocols. We're conducting a review to ensure that medical emergencies can be addressed more quickly in the future, even during ceremonial duties. She then shared something unexpected. Private Thompson asked if he could meet you briefly before you returned to America. He wanted to thank you personally. An hour later, Marcus found himself in an unprecedented situation, sitting across from a royal guard in civilian clothes in a quiet London cafe. James Thompson, as Marcus learned his name, appeared much younger and more vulnerable without his imposing ceremonial uniform. "I can't thank you enough," James said earnestly. "I was trying so hard to maintain my post that I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. You probably saved me from a very embarrassing and dangerous collapse." Marcus was moved by the young man's gratitude. "I have a sister with diabetes," he explained. "I've seen her go through similar episodes. When I saw the signs, I couldn't just stand there and watch." James shared his story. He had been a royal guard for 8 months, following a family tradition of military service. The morning of the incident, he had received news that his younger brother had been in a minor car accident. In his worry and rush to get to his post, he had forgotten his usual pre-duty meal. "The irony is that we're trained to handle medical emergencies for others," James said with a rueful smile. "But the culture of never breaking character, never showing weakness, sometimes makes it hard for us to seek help when we need it ourselves." Their conversation continued for over an hour. Marcus learned about the intense training, the pride in serving, and the challenges of maintaining ceremonial duties in a modern world. James learned about Marcus's work as a software engineer and his admiration for British traditions and culture. "You know," James said as their meeting concluded, "you've actually helped change something important here. There's now a new protocol being developed for medical situations during ceremonial duties. Guards will have a discreet signal they can use to call for medical assistance without breaking their formal posture." Marcus was amazed. "Really? Just from what happened this morning?" "Your video went viral," James laughed. "But more importantly, it started conversations at the highest levels about balancing tradition with welfare. Change doesn't happen often in our institution, but when it does, it's usually because someone from the outside provides a fresh perspective." As they parted ways, James shook Marcus's hand firmly. "You've made a difference here that will help future guards. That's something to be proud of." That evening, Marcus reflected on his extraordinary day. What had begun as a simple tourist visit had evolved into a cross-cultural friendship and had apparently contributed to institutional change at one of the world's most traditional organizations. The story was gaining international attention on social media, but Marcus was most pleased by the personal connections he had made and the knowledge that his actions had potentially improved conditions for future royal guards facing similar medical emergencies. Tourist confronts royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Conclusion. 6 months after Marcus returned to Chicago, he received an unexpected package from London. Inside was an official letter from Buckingham Palace, along with a framed photograph of the new medical emergency protocols being implemented for the royal guards. The letter, signed by a senior palace official, thanked him for his observant intervention and constructive advocacy that had led to important improvements in guardsmen welfare procedures. It also included an invitation to return to London as a guest of the palace to witness the implementation of the new safety measures. Marcus also maintained regular contact with James Thompson through email and social media. The young guard had been promoted and was now helping to train new recruits on the updated medical emergency protocols. He often shared Marcus's story as an example of how civilian concern could lead to positive institutional change. The incident had become something of a legend among the royal guards. New recruits learned about the American Tourist Protocol, a discreet hand signal system that allowed guards to request medical assistance without breaking their ceremonial stance. The story served as a reminder that duty and welfare could coexist with proper systems in place. Marcus's video and the subsequent news coverage had sparked broader discussions about workplace safety in traditional institutions worldwide. Military organizations in several countries reviewed their own ceremonial protocols to ensure better protection for personnel during formal duties. The German nurse who had supported Marcus's intervention had also become part of the story's legacy. She was invited to consult on the new medical protocols, bringing her professional expertise to help create faster response procedures for future emergencies. A year later, Marcus did return to London, accepting the palace invitation. He was given a private tour and met with several guards who thanked him for the changes his actions had initiated. The new protocols had already prevented 3 potential medical incidents among ceremonial guards at various royal locations. During this visit, he witnessed a discreet medical response in action. A guard used the new hand signal system during a ceremony, and medical personnel responded within 90 seconds without disrupting the formal proceedings. The guard received quick treatment for a minor issue and was able to return to duty safely. James Thompson, now a sergeant, escorted Marcus through parts of the palace usually closed to tourists. "You started something important here," he told his American friend. "But more than that, you showed us that caring about people transcends cultural boundaries and protocol." The story had also changed Marcus personally. He became more confident in speaking up when he witnessed problems or injustices. His experience at Buckingham Palace had taught him that respectful intervention, even in foreign situations, could lead to positive outcomes. Back in Chicago, Marcus often shared his London experience during presentations at work and community events. His message was simple: when you see someone in need, cultural differences and formal protocols shouldn't prevent you from offering help. The incident had proven that tradition and innovation could coexist, that institutions could adapt without losing their essential character, and that sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to identify solutions that insiders might miss. Marcus's sister, whose diabetes had inadvertently given him the knowledge to help James, was proud of her brother's actions. "You did exactly what I would have wanted someone to do for me," she told him. The story of the American tourist who confronted a royal guard became more than just an interesting anecdote. It became a case study in effective advocacy, cross-cultural communication, and the power of individual action to create institutional change. Years later, when tourists visit Buckingham Palace and observe the ceremonial guards, they are witnessing not just ancient traditions but also modern adaptations that prioritize both ceremony and human welfare. Changes that began with one concerned tourist who refused to remain silent when he saw someone in need of help.